This is Wings on the Air.
Welcome to Wings on the Air. My name is Ann Edenfield-Sweet. I'm the Executive Director and founder of Wings for Life International. And today we're going to get advice about the Parole Board. This is something I don't know very much about, and we are so thrilled to have Cisco McSorley with us today. He is the head of the New Mexico Parole Board. So Cisco, welcome.
Well, I'm head of the agency. The board itself is above me. They're my bosses.
Oh, you're in charge. Oh, okay. Well, see, I even had that wrong. Okay. Well,
everybody does.
Okay. Well, first of all, tell me a little bit about your past, because I know a little bit about it, but the listeners might not. So tell us about your past.
Well, I grew up in a home, very religious, of people who believed that everybody was worth saving. Everybody has a soul that's worth saving. And not only that, we have a duty. And when I came into the legislature almost 40 years ago, I started meeting people. Interestingly enough, the person who you probably know, Chuck Colson, who was one of the Nixon dirty works guy who went to prison. But when he went to prison, he had an epiphany, and he totally changed. Mm-hmm. And not only did he change his heart, but he has now spent his life trying to reform the prison systems. But from the late 70s and through the 80s and even through the 90s, there wasn't much reform in terms of trying to change the system. It was all through the 90s, it was pretty much lock them up and throw away the key. The problem was we had to throw away a lot of keys and a lot of souls, and it wasn't working. So states gradually have been experimenting with the changes that need to be taken, and many of them have become very successful. And it's not a partisan issue of red and blue. The state of Kansas, for instance, has a 13% recidivism rate over 2 years. The state of Oregon has an 8% recidivism rate. But what it takes is a sea change in people's thinking. You have to go from lock them up and throw away the key to what are we going to do with people because they're all going to get out.
Thank you for sharing all of that. And I'll give you a little history about us. 25 years ago, it was more than 25 years ago, but my first husband went to prison. So 25 years ago, I went to Chuck Colson. I met with Chuck Colson, and our name came from, instead of Angel Tree, it was going to be Angel Wings, to be God's angel wings to reach out and to help and to support and comfort. Because as a family member of a prisoner, no one was there to help me. And that's the reason I wrote my book, Family Arrested, because no one was there to help me. So we go back a ways in different, you were in the legislative session, and I was out here, the wife of an inmate, and then trying to help make change for my side of things. So it's interesting, and I'm so thrilled that you're here today because now you could share. And I know that you come with this heart and this passion for trying to help and make change. And so tell us about the Parole Board. Tell us about how that works and how people get involved, and just let's start with that.
Okay, well, first of all, it's a very small agency, and it is totally separate from the corrections department. Most people think we're part of corrections. We are not. We are directly under the governor. There is a board that consists of 15 people and a staff of 5. And I run the staff. I keep the bills paid and the lights on and stuff. And the paperwork, which is huge, keeping track. We have about 7,000 or 8,000 people in our prisons, men and women, and we have about 17,000 people on parole and probation. And so it is our job, after somebody leaves the prison system, we take jurisdiction of them, and we decide, and we are the ones that make the decision as to where they'll live, what kind of restrictions they'll have, et cetera, et cetera. Now, a lot of times those are recommendations made by the corrections department, and we work together because the corrections department actually has the personnel under which the probation and parole division works. But if something goes wrong, they come to us for a change in the plan or to recommit somebody for a parole violation.
So after somebody is released, then it goes to the parole board, and then they make these final decisions, and then the probation and parole officers are the ones that follow through with the guidelines that you've established.
That's right.
Is that correct?
They enforce, or they help these prisoners hopefully getting their job applications in, arranging transportation, those kinds of things. Exactly.
And so once they've completed their paperwork and they have done everything that is required, working with that probation officer, then the probation officer goes back to you, and then that's when you clear the case then? Or how does that work?
Well, if you mean at the end, most parole terms are for 2 years. And we have something in New Mexico called determinative sentencing. In other words, the way the statute reads is, you may be convicted of a crime and sentenced to 5 years, but automatically at the end of 5 years, you have 2 years of parole. Now, there's different parole times for sex offenders or people convicted of murder, but the overwhelming majority have a 2-year parole term. And at the end of 2 years, then the probation and parole people tell us this person is finished, and we sign the certification saying that they have finalized parole and they're no longer on parole.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, I want to go back. How does somebody get on the board in the first place? You said there were 15 members.
There's 15 members, and since we are directly under the governor picks the parole board. There is an application on the governor's webpage and on our webpage. Anybody who wants to be on the board, all they have to do is fill out the application and send it to the governor's office. Now, the board is pretty much full right now, so I can't say, but you serve for a 6-year term, although many of our parole board members have extended to 12 and 15 years that they've been on the board. It's hard to get people because it's an unpaid position. You have to really want to do this work, and it's trying because you see a lot of failure and you have to maintain a positive attitude, and that's why we don't get a lot of applications.
Now, when people talk about, because I work with, of course, the people that have been in prison and coming out, and I'm going to see the parole board. Does that mean they're physically going to meet with people? How does that process work?
Actually, that's what it used to mean, but during these days, we've gone to video conferencing. So the parole board meets with prisoners through video even before they're released from prison, because their parole plan is supposed to be finalized up to 6 months before they're released. Plus, the Corrections Department has total authority over how much they have in good time. We don't know any of that. That's none of our business. We just determine, after meeting with the potential parolee, whether the plan is suitable for them.
Okay. Now, is there anything that somebody can do if they are in prison to start to prepare and get ready? Because I've been asked to write letters to go to the parole board, as an example. So what kinds of things would you recommend that somebody do, or is there anything they can do?
Absolutely. The day somebody walks in the door, they should be preparing for their parole, especially if they're going to try to be a model prisoner. You can get 50% of your time excused for good time in New Mexico.
50%?
50%. Now, on some crimes, violent crimes, it's you have to serve 85%. But you're going to get this good time if you try to work at it. And so you should be doing things like getting your GED if you don't have a GED, trying to do a trade, trying to better yourself, even taking college classes. And the other thing that you need to be doing is making sure that you've applied everywhere you can think of for housing, which is a huge problem, and a job. We give people time after they get out to get a job, but when you have a job waiting for you, that's the best sign of success we can have.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And a place to live.
And a
Because
place to
where
live,
are
that's
you
right.
going to go when you get out?
Yeah. And what we see a lot is people go home to their families because their families are the only people that'll take them. We do have some halfway houses and assisted living in New Mexico, but the problem is a lot of those are in the Albuquerque area. And you know, people growing up in New Mexico, they have been indoctrinated that Albuquerque is not a good place where you want to go. And so here they're coming from, you know, Hobbs or Clayton or Silver City, and they have these bad images of Albuquerque, and yet the only place they can find housing is in Albuquerque.
I know.
And that's when we have problems sometimes.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So you're recommending to people the day they walk in that door, okay, start planning. How are you going to get out of here? And I think you mentioned at one point to me in one of our conversations that the average person in New Mexico only spends a couple years behind bars anyway.
30 months.
30 months.
And I say this over and over again to people in the general public. You have to understand, virtually all of these prisoners are coming out at some time or another. And the point is, do you want them to have a job they go to in the day, or do you want them in your house at 10 o'clock in the morning when nobody's home?
Yeah.
It is the whole society. You know, we are in this together. You cannot ignore these folks coming out of prison, or the next thing you know, they're going to be in your home or in your car.
You know, it's so amazing because we look at the statistics, and there is a national study that says 1 out of 3 Americans have something that impacts employability in their background. So some kind of criminal record, 1 out of 3. And then 1 out of 2 Americans have an immediate family member that has been in or will be incarcerated within their lifetime. And of course, I'm one of them, so 1 out of 2 right here.
Well,
and it's amazing.
In New Mexico, if you can believe this, just a few years ago, we had over 430 different effects that going to prison. You couldn't get a barber's license, you couldn't get this kind of license, you were restricted from using your car. And so all of these things add up to barriers to getting a job and to raising your family.
Absolutely.
And so we were going back and trying to, in my last days in the legislature, we were culling through those, trying to figure out which ones really made sense and which one of them were just purely punitive.
Now, are you saying, being involved now with the Parole Board, that they are starting to make changes as far as trying to be more supportive of the returning citizen and trying to be helpful?
Yes and no. It's a long haul. It requires a lot of education. And I think a lot of people have gotten the word, and yet there's still those folks that, you know, in fact, one of the things that we started off by saying is, it's against the law now to ask somebody just on the initial application if they've ever been convicted of a crime.
Right.
Because so many times we found employers never giving that person an interview or a chance to explain or to find out who they really are. Now, it doesn't mean you can't ask. Once you're through the initial process and sitting down with somebody, sure, you can ask them about that. But give, for gosh sakes, give these people a chance.
Give them a chance to get in the door.
That's right.
When I work with our returning citizens, and of course we teach them how to get a job, and the first thing that I say is, okay, be prepared to tell them that you are a returning citizen. And most people don't know that language. So then you say, now let me define that. Let me tell you what a returning citizen is, and let me tell you how I am that returning citizen, and how law-abiding and hardworking and a good dad or a good mom. And in fact, really good working, I want to work for you, and I promise I will be the best employee and build that up. And when you are honest with somebody and you come forth with that, because sooner or later they are going to find out that somebody has some kind of record. You might as well tell them, but to get in that door, to not have to put that X in the box that automatically, for so many people, won't even look at that resume then.
That's right.
And,
I have a funny story about this. About 20 years ago, Florida was way ahead of the rest of the country in doing a lot of these reforms. And Walmart had a program in Florida choosing the teenager of the year. And they chose this teenager, they announced her for all of these great qualities. And it turned out she had been in juvie for many years. And they were worried at first.
Yeah.
But they were courageous enough to go through with it. And she turned out to be a model person for them, and really everything they wanted.
Oh, that's wonderful.
was.
That is a great story.
Isn't it?
Yeah.
Isn't it?
And I always like to close with a story, so we got a story right here at the beginning, because so many people, when they're given the chance, they're given that opportunity. So how many of us have done dumb things when we were younger? But to be able to give that chance and to see the capabilities of an individual.
Well, and
so
between
important.
you and me, we know we never did dumb things.
Oh,
okay?
no.
So we are the
didn't.
exception.
Oh, yeah, we are the exception. That's right. Now, family, we know, is so important. And so how does the family, from your perspective, impact the parole board? Can they impact the parole board? Talk to us, because we need to be educated so we can share with the families how to help.
Well, let me put it succinctly. Most people understand now, or have heard the term, that you don't just send the prisoner to prison, you send the whole family.
Yep.
Well, it's the same way on parole. If you're going to have a parolee in your home, that means you can't have alcohol, you can't have drugs, you can't have any of those things in the home. And many times these parolees have a problem, they don't have a car, so you're going to be responsible for taking them around, and they're going to have a curfew, so you're going to be responsible. And on top of that, you have to sign a document, your family, that without a warrant, because when somebody is on parole, they've lost a lot of their rights. Without a warrant and without notice, a probation and parole officer can go into your house. So you have to understand, you're giving up a lot of your privacy to keep a parolee in your home, and that's a big commitment. So yes, it is. You're going to be chaperoning them and chauffeuring them and doing all these things.
And also, they can write letters too, can't they?
Absolutely.
And be supportive. And what about employers or even staff in prisons? Have you ever gotten letters from wardens, or maybe some of the volunteer programs that go into the prisons? Have any of those folks written letters for you?
You know, it's interesting, because especially on those 30-year lifers, you know, we have two kinds of a life sentence in New Mexico. Life without possibility of parole, you're never ever going to be eligible for a parole, you're never getting out. And the other is 30 years. And after 30 years, you don't automatically get out, but you're eligible for parole. And the irony about it is, we see on these 30-year lifers, one of the most determinative letters we get is from the wardens, saying
that's
this
wonderful.
fellow has been a model citizen. We believe that he's changed his life, and we think he's going to make it on the outside, and we want you to grant him parole. It's a huge letter to receive in the file.
Well, I know I shared that I've been asked to write letters, because I go into the prisons and I've gotten to know inmates, and when they've been there for many, many years, I see them year after year. They're the chaplain's assistant. If I'm sending a phone call, and they might even answer the phone at the chaplain's office at the prison, and I get to know these folks, and I see how dedicated and how caring they are. And so I have written some letters on their behalf, and hopefully it's made a difference.
Well, you mentioned it. You know, the unsung heroes of the prison system are the chaplains.
Oh, they are.
They're the ones that tirelessly go into the prisons day after day and try to give these folks a new path for their lives.
And they do.
And they do. And they're
they do.
hugely
Yeah.
successful.
Absolutely. In fact, the recidivism rates usually for people involved, really involved in any kind of faith-based programming, regardless of the religious background, is much, much lower than anybody else. I know Prison Fellowship has those statistics, and I would hate to quote them today because they change every year, but I know they're very low. At least half of the recidivism rate of anybody else.
And they do this unpaid by the state.
Yeah.
Unsung heroes.
So can other inmates write letters on behalf of, if somebody's helped tutor them or help them? Have you ever gotten any letters from other inmates?
Well, usually, no, I haven't seen them.
Okay.
I'm not saying we don't get them,
Okay.
but I haven't seen them in my year tenure there. And, that's part of the rub, and which is a catch-22 for a lot of these prisoners. When you come out on parole, you're not allowed to associate with prisoners
I
except
know.
those approved by your probation and parole officer. And so showing letters of the very kinds of people that you're not supposed to be associating with sometimes is a real catch-22. So, but I know in the California prisons, what they're doing is starting groups of inmates who are very hard on each other, who are trying to teach each other, look, if you're really going to try to convince the parole board you've changed your heart and you've changed your view of the world, show us first. And these groups have been very successful that when they mentor people that are coming up for parole, those are the people that get parole because it's like group therapy. They're teaching these guys how to be model citizens.
Well, and that is so important, and that peer mentoring, and I know New Mexico is really doing some wonderful work with peer mentors within the prison system. Of course, we've got the chaplaincy program, and now we've got the men, it's all men right now that have graduated through that seminarian program, and now the seminarians are out in various prisons across the state. And they are making a difference, and they are making people accountable. And I go into the God pods within all of our various prisons, and they have to live up to a certain standard to be in that God's pod, or they won't be able to be there. So if you're listening and you're an inmate, because we hope that some of these listeners are going to be people in prison too, that you can start making a difference right now and start thinking about how you can help one another, and perhaps write a letter. If you're still in prison, that's not going to compromise you. If somebody has really made a difference in your life, let them know, because I have met the most wonderful people. I always say I go to prison to meet the greatest people in the world, and I do, because I've seen them change their lives, and I see how they help one another and how they really care.
If I may make one other suggestion.
Sure.
If you're serious about changing your life while you're in prison, you have to get away from your gang.
Yeah.
If you were a gang member, because it's on all the forms that every probation and parole officer sees, that the correction sees, everybody sees, if you've been in a gang, you have to do the hard work of telling those gang members, look, I need to change my life. I have a kid at home, or I have a wife, I have a family, and I can't be doing this anymore, and I need to change my life. Now, sometimes there are repercussions from the gang members, but many times the gangs will let people go.
Thank you for sharing that. I think that's really important, and that's so true, because that label will go with them all the way through, and once they get back out that door too.
That's right.
So yeah, so that's so important. Now
The other thing, if I can make one other little...
Of course.
You know, this may sound crazy to a lot of people, but you know the other skill that most inmates should be trying to learn is typing.
Oh, yes.
You know, for a lot of good reasons, you don't have the internet, or you have a very limited access to the internet in prison. But the basic tools you need for many jobs coming out is the ability to know the keyboard. So if you know the keyboard and can type, you can go to CNM, you can go all over this state that you're paroled to and learn the internet then. And that gives you job opportunities that you never had before.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. I've been telling wardens since I started this 25 years ago and started going into prisons, get them to type, because you can't even apply for a job today if you can't type. At any job, you have to be able to type. Type up that invoice, type up the car oil change. You've got to use a computer to do it. So thank you.
And the other
for
thing
mentioning
about that is, in Florida, if you can believe it, one of the biggest prison systems in the nation, they are giving their inmates iPads.
Ohio too.
And
Yep.
the point is, these are an incentive.
Yes.
If you have a problem, they'll take your iPad away. So it is one thing that keeps people in line. And the irony about what they're finding is, these are specially programmed so you can't get out to the internet, but they do allow some limited internet use. And they're finding that these inmates don't abuse it. And then they get to keep it when they leave.
Yeah, it's a wonderful program,
Right.
and it's preparing them for the future. I mean, people come out of prison 30 years, they don't know how to get on an escalator, much less how to pick up a phone.
Yeah,
What is a phone?
yeah.
How to even use it? And if we could be teaching that in prison, so I'm so glad you're in your position because you've got that vision and you see the hope, and that people do have. Can make changes and can come out, and they're going to come out, but they can come out and be productive. Very quickly, why don't you talk about REI? Define
Okay.
what that is.
REI is Release Eligible Inmate, REI. And basically, these are people who either don't want to come out on parole, or they can't find suitable housing or a job, or they just can't get out. And what the law allows them to do is spend their 2 years of parole or parts of their 2 years in prison. Now, some inmates like it that way because when they walk out of the prison after being REI for 2 years, they have absolutely nobody watching them. In other words, there's no curfew, there's no limitation on their alcohol use, there's no limitation on their driving, there's no limitation as to where they live or whom they live with. And so some inmates think it's a great deal. Unfortunately, what they don't realize is it's a great deal to get back into prison a lot faster. It's those prisoners that are willing to submit to these kinds of oversight that are having the success. So REI means you can't get out or you're not getting out because you don't have a parole plan that the parole board can approve.
And you know, I'm glad to hear that, because that you're not in favor of that either. I'm not either. I think people need to get out as soon as they can. I believe halfway houses have a place, and that supervision can help people so much to be able to get from that regimented life of prison, and this is when you get up and when you take a shower and when you eat and when you sleep and everything else, to okay, halfway house, you've got some guidelines, but you've got a little flexibility, finally going home and kind of preparing and trying
I'm
to...
glad you mentioned halfway
Yeah.
houses. That's innovation that the federal correction system has gone to in a heavy way, which is great. You don't have all the freedoms of being in an assisted living, but the other little thing about it is, if you do fall down in the 2 years, instead of going back to prison, you go back to the halfway house.
That's right.
And you start over.
That's right.
You know, a
Yeah.
lot of people, you know, failure is...
I know, and we don't want anybody to fail. And so I am so glad that you're working with us, Parole Board. You're in charge of it and supervising it. This is wonderful. We'd like to thank Cisco McSorley for being with us today, head of New Mexico Parole Board Director. And this has been Wings on the Air. It's sponsored by Rainstar Capital Group. Bob Moore is the man to call. His phone number is 505-331-4246. Rainstar Capital Group. Give them a call today. Thanks for joining us on Wings on the Air.
Wings on the Air is sponsored by Rainstar Capital Group.